In the vast wilderness of northern Montana, where ancient forests meet rugged mountains, the morning air carried a different kind of tension. Thomas Walker had been tracking animals in these woods for over 20 years, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to discover on this cold autumn morning. The wilderness had always been his sanctuary, a place where he understood every whisper of the wind and each subtle change in the environment. But lately, something had been different, something that made even his experienced hunter's instincts bristle with uncertainty. The sun had barely risen above the mountain peaks, casting long shadows through the towering pine trees. A fresh blanket of snow covered the ground, making every track and movement easy to spot for an experienced hunter like Thomas. His weathered face showed the marks of countless days spent in these woods, but his eyes remained sharp and alert, missing nothing as he moved silently through the forest. The forest itself seemed to hold secrets. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches heavy with snow, creating a cathedral-like canopy that filtered the early morning light. Thomas knew every trail and ridge in these parts, every stream and clearing. This knowledge had served him well over the years, building his reputation as one of the most respected outdoorsmen in the region. But now that same knowledge made him acutely aware that something was very different in his beloved wilderness. Thomas had earned his understanding of these mountains through years of patience and observation. Each season brought its own rhythms, its own patterns that he had learned to read like a book. The movements of deer herds, the hunting patterns of local wolf packs, the seasonal habits of bears, all of these had become as familiar to him as the lines on his own hands. But in recent weeks, those patterns had begun to change in ways that defied explanation. The changes started subtly at first. Thomas noticed the deer populations shifting away from their traditional feeding grounds. The elk herds, usually predictable in their movements, had begun taking unusual routes through the mountains. Even the smallest creatures, the rabbits and squirrels that usually scattered at his approach, now seemed to disappear long before he came near, as if a greater threat lurked in these woods. The morning birds, typically vocal with their dawn chorus, had grown quieter, their songs shorter and more hesitant. The very air seemed different, carrying scents that made Thomas' skin prickle with awareness. Everything about these mountains, this place he knew as well as his own home, felt altered in subtle but significant ways. Something extraordinary was happening in these woods, something that would challenge everything Thomas thought he knew about the natural world. Word of the unusual happenings in the wilderness spread quickly through the small mountain community. Local ranchers were the first to raise concerns at the town's monthly meeting in the old community hall. Their stories painted a picture that grew more mysterious with each passing day, creating a sense of unease that touched everyone in the valley. Old Bill Henderson, who had lived on his family's ranch for over 60 years, spoke of strange noises in the night. These weren't the familiar howls of the local wolf packs that everyone had grown accustomed to. These sounds were different, a mix of deep, guttural growls and howls that made his cattle restless and his horses nervous. His livestock, usually calm even during storms, now huddled together in their enclosures, their eyes wide with fear at something unseen in the darkness. Sarah Matthews, whose property bordered the national forest, reported finding tracks in the snow that didn't match anything she had seen in her 30 years of ranching. The prints were confusing, a mixture of what looked like wolf tracks alongside something much larger, but they moved together in ways that made no sense to experienced woodsmen. Her dogs, usually eager to track any animal scent, refused to follow these trails, tucking their tails and whining when urged forward. The Forest Service had dismissed their concerns, attributing the unusual behavior to natural shifts in wildlife patterns due to the changing climate. But the local Native American elders from the nearby reservation had grown quiet when asked about the changes. Their silence spoke volumes to those who understood their deep connection to the land. Some of the older tribal members whispered about ancient stories, tales of times when the natural order of things would shift in unexpected ways. Even the most skeptical members of the community began to take notice when hunting became more difficult. Experienced hunters returned empty-handed from areas that had always provided reliable game. They spoke of an eerie silence in the woods, of finding unusual tracks, and of feeling watched by something they couldn't see. The local wildlife photographers, who usually captured beautiful images of wolves, bears, and elk, now returned with empty memory cards. At the local diner, over cups of strong coffee, people shared their theories. Some believed a new predator had moved into the area, disturbing the natural order. Others suggested more fantastic explanations, drawing on old legends and stories passed down through generations. But everyone agreed that something unprecedented was happening in their mountains. The tension in the community grew with each passing week. Ranchers began bringing their livestock in earlier, parents grew more protective of their children, and the wilderness that had been their home for generations suddenly felt foreign, filled with secrets that defied understanding. Thomas woke long before sunrise, his mind already focused on the task ahead. The temperature had dropped significantly overnight, creating perfect tracking conditions with a fresh layer of snow. He moved through his morning routine with practiced efficiency, gathering the gear he had prepared the night before. Today wasn't about hunting in the traditional sense. Today was about finding answers. His old truck bounced along the worn Forest Service road in the pre-dawn darkness, headlights cutting through the falling snow. Thomas had chosen his starting point carefully, planning to begin his search in an area where several ranchers had reported unusual activity. He carried his trusted rifle, more out of habit and respect for the wilderness than any intention to use it. His pack contained his camera, binoculars, extra layers of clothing, and enough supplies to last through the day if needed. The darkness began to lift as he parked his truck at the end of the service road. The air was so cold it made his lungs ache with each breath, but the discomfort was familiar, almost welcome. Thomas pulled his wool hat down tighter and adjusted his pack, taking a moment to survey the landscape before him. The forest stretched out vast and silent, the fresh snow creating a clean slate that would reveal any movement or activity. He started his trek at a steady pace, his boots crunching softly in the fresh snow. Years of experience had taught him how to move quietly, even in these conditions. Every few minutes, he paused to listen and observe, noting how the forest seemed different in subtle ways. The usual morning sounds were muted, as if the wildlife was holding its breath. Even the wind moving through the pine branches seemed to carry a different tone. Thomas followed a route that would take him past several areas where the strange tracks had been reported. He kept his eyes on the ground, noting every disturbance in the snow. His trained gaze could distinguish between ordinary animal movements and something out of place. The morning light grew stronger as he moved deeper into the wilderness, revealing more details of the landscape around him. After an hour of careful progress, he reached a ridgeline that offered a view of the surrounding valley. Thomas paused here, removing his binoculars to survey the area. The sun had risen enough to illuminate the snow-covered slopes, creating a landscape of light and shadow. From this vantage point, he could see several game trails that converged in the valley below. If there was unusual activity in these woods, those trails would likely show evidence of it. The first sign appeared just as the morning sun fully cleared the mountain peaks. Thomas noticed the disturbance in the snow near the base of an ancient pine tree that made him pause. He knelt down to examine it more closely, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. The tracks here were unlike anything he had seen in his 20 years of hunting and tracking in these mountains. Wolf prints were clearly visible in the fresh snow, but they were intermixed with something else, large, heavy tracks that could only belong to a bear. Yet the pattern was all wrong. Thomas knew bears should be preparing for hibernation at this time of year, their movements typically slow and solitary. But these tracks told a different story. The bear prints moved alongside the wolf tracks, not in the chaotic pattern of a chase or fight, but in what appeared to be a coordinated movement. Thomas pulled out his camera, carefully photographing the unusual tracks from multiple angles. He placed his hand next to one of the bear prints for scale, his own large hand dwarfed by the massive paw print. The depth of the impressions in the snow suggested an animal of extraordinary size. But it was the wolf tracks that truly puzzled him. They showed no signs of fear or aggression, no indication of the natural adversarial relationship that should exist between wolves and bears. As he followed the trail, more evidence appeared. Broken branches high up on the trees showed signs of something large passing through. While closer to the ground, the snow was disturbed in patterns that suggested coordinated movement between multiple animals. The tracks led deeper into a part of the forest that local hunters typically avoided, an area of dense undergrowth and steep terrain. The morning air had grown unusually still, creating an eerie silence that made every small sound seem magnified. Thomas's instincts, honed by decades in the wilderness, were sending warning signals he couldn't ignore. He found himself moving more cautiously, checking his surroundings more frequently. The forest around him felt different, charged with an energy he had never experienced before. Near a small clearing, he discovered more compelling evidence. The remains of a recent kill showed signs of both wolf and bear feeding, but not in the usual competitive way. The prey had been shared with clear signs that the predators had fed together. This behavior defied everything Thomas knew about wild animal interactions. He documented everything meticulously, knowing that what he was witnessing could be groundbreaking. Thomas began following the unusual tracks with heightened awareness, his years of experience guiding every careful step. The trail led him deeper into the wilderness, toward an area of the forest that few people ever visited. The terrain grew more challenging, with steep slopes and thick undergrowth that would deter most hunters. But the tracks showed no sign of hesitation, moving purposefully through the difficult landscape. The morning had warmed slightly, causing small drops of melting snow to fall from the branches above. Each drop created tiny echoes in the unusually still air. Thomas moved slowly, documenting everything with his camera. The tracks told a story that became more fascinating with each passing mile. The wolf pack, which he estimated to number at least 8 based on the prints, moved in perfect coordination with the bear's massive tracks. Their movements showed no signs of the natural fear or aggression that should exist between these species. As he climbed higher into the mountains, Thomas noticed other changes in the forest. The usual small game trails had been abandoned, with no recent rabbit or deer tracks crossing his path. Even the birds seemed scarce, their morning songs replaced by an eerie silence. The whole forest felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something significant to happen. The air carried unfamiliar scents that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. After several hours of careful tracking, Thomas found himself in a part of the forest he had rarely visited. The trees here were older, their massive trunks covered in thick moss. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the canopy in strange ways, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to move with a life of their own. The tracks he followed became fresher, the snow disturbances more recent. Whatever he was tracking, it had passed through this area within the last few hours. Thomas paused to check his GPS unit, marking waypoints that would help him retrace his path if needed. He had covered nearly 5 miles from his starting point, moving steadily upward in elevation. The air had grown thinner, making each breath more deliberate. But it wasn't just the altitude that made breathing difficult. There was a palpable tension in the air, a feeling of anticipation that seemed to grow stronger with each step forward. The tracking conditions remained perfect, with the fresh snow revealing every movement of the animals he followed. What struck Thomas most was how deliberate the trail was. These weren't the random wanderings of forest creatures. The bear and wolves were moving with clear purpose, heading towards something. As he crested another ridge, Thomas caught sight of a natural clearing ahead. The tracks led directly toward it, and something in his gut told him this was where he would find answers to the mystery that had been building for weeks. Thomas approached the clearing with the utmost caution, his heart pounding not from exertion, but from anticipation. He found a position behind a fallen log that offered both concealment and a clear view of the area ahead. The natural bowl-shaped clearing stretched out before him, surrounded by towering pines and snow-covered rock faces. Morning sunlight now fully illuminated the space, creating perfect visibility across the entire area. As he settled into his observation point, Thomas carefully arranged his equipment. His camera rested on the log, ready for quick access, while his binoculars remained steady in his hands. The clearing below showed signs of recent activity, with numerous tracks crisscrossing the fresh snow. But it was what emerged from the shadows that made Thomas forget to breathe. A large gray wolf appeared first, moving with confident steps into the clearing. Its behavior immediately struck Thomas as unusual. There was none of the typical caution that characterized wolf movement in open spaces. Behind it, more wolves emerged from the tree line, their fur a mix of gray and black, their movements synchronized in a way that spoke of a well-established pack. Thomas counted them silently. 8, then 10, finally 12 wolves in total, all moving with the same strange confidence. But it was what came next that made Thomas's hands tremble as he raised his camera. From the same direction as the wolves emerged a bear of impossible size. Its fur was a deep brown, almost black in places, and its movements showed both power and an unexpected grace. The bear was larger than any grizzly Thomas had ever encountered in his decades of experience, its massive frame casting a shadow across the snow as it moved into the sunlight. What happened next defied everything Thomas knew about wildlife behavior. Instead of the violent confrontation that should have erupted between natural enemies, the bear moved among the wolves as if it were a member of their pack. The wolves showed no fear, no aggression. Some even appeared to defer to the bear's presence, creating a social dynamic that shattered every known principle of predator interactions in the wild. Thomas watched in amazement as the bear and wolves moved together through the clearing, their movements coordinated in a way that suggested this was not a chance encounter, but an established relationship. The bear seemed to communicate with the wolves through subtle body language, and the wolves responded in kind. They were working together, sharing territory, and exhibiting social behaviors that would revolutionize scientific understanding of wildlife interactions. The morning light caught the steam of their breath in the cold air as they moved, creating an almost mythical quality to the scene. Thomas documented everything with his camera, his hands steadier now as he captured what he knew would be historically significant footage. The bear's size became even more apparent when it stood briefly on its hind legs, towering over its wolf companions, yet showing no aggression toward them. The wolves, in turn, moved around the bear with a familiarity that spoke of long association, their pack formation adapting to include this unlikely ally. For the next 2 hours, Thomas remained motionless behind his fallen log, documenting the most extraordinary wildlife behavior he had ever witnessed. The interaction between the bear and wolf pack revealed a complex social structure that would challenge every existing theory about predator relationships in the wild. Each moment brought new revelations that left Thomas struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what he was seeing. The wolves had organized themselves in a pattern that included the bear as a central figure. The pack's alpha pair, distinguished by their confident bearing and the deference shown by other pack members, seemed to share leadership with the massive grizzly. When the alpha male moved to investigate something at the clearing's edge, the bear followed, and younger wolves fell into formation behind them both. This cooperative hierarchy defied natural order in ways that would leave wildlife experts speechless. Thomas observed how they communicated through a sophisticated system of body language. The bear would lift its head in a particular way, and the wolves would respond, spreading out in a hunting formation. When one of the wolves gave a low growl, showing a level of interspecies understanding never before documented. Their movements were so coordinated, it appeared they had been working together for generations. The clearing itself showed evidence of their successful partnership. Around its edges, Thomas spotted the remains of several recent kills. The feeding patterns visible in the snow told a remarkable story. Instead of competing for the prey, the bear and wolves had clearly shared their kills. Some carcasses showed signs of cooperative hunting, with wounds that could only have been inflicted by both species working in tandem. This partnership had evolved beyond mere tolerance into a genuine hunting alliance. As the morning progressed, Thomas witnessed their hunting strategy in action. A small herd of elk appeared at the far end of the clearing, and the bear-wolf alliance moved with practiced precision. The wolves spread out in their traditional hunting formation, but with a crucial difference. The bear positioned itself strategically and using its massive presence to help guide the prey toward the waiting pack members. The elk, confused by this unprecedented combination of predators, fell into disarray. Though Thomas couldn't see the actual hunt from his position, the coordinated movement of the group left no doubt about their tactical advantage. Most remarkable was the social bonding Thomas observed during quiet moments. Young wolves would rest near the bear, showing none of the fear that should exist between these species. The bear demonstrated a surprising gentleness in these interactions, its enormous size and power held carefully in check. At one point, the entire group rested together in the morning sun, the bear surrounded by wolves in a scene that appeared more like a family portrait than a gathering of natural enemies. Throughout his observation, Thomas noticed how their combined presence had altered the entire ecosystem of the clearing. Other animals that approached quickly retreated, clearly unprepared for this new apex predator partnership. The air itself seemed charged with the significance of what was unfolding, as if nature herself was acknowledging this evolutionary leap in predator behavior. Every movement, every interaction, every shared moment between the bear and wolves spoke of an adaptation that would force science to reconsider everything known about wildlife cooperation. As the bear and wolf pack eventually moved away from the clearing, disappearing into the dense forest, Thomas remained in his position for several long moments. His hands trembled slightly as he reviewed the hundreds of photographs on his camera, each image providing irrefutable evidence of something that would have been dismissed as impossible just hours before. The morning's discovery would not only reshape scientific understanding, but would also remind humanity that the natural world still held mysteries capable of leaving us speechless with wonder. The sun had climbed high in the sky when Thomas finally began his journey back to civilization. His mind raced with the implications of what he had witnessed, the strange noises that had worried the ranchers, the unusual tracks that had puzzled experienced outdoorsmen, and the silent wisdom of the Native American elders who had sensed these changes all now made perfect sense. What he had documented was more than just an unusual animal behavior. It was evidence of nature's incredible ability to adapt and evolve, creating alliances that seemed impossible by conventional wisdom. As he made his way back through the forest, Thomas noticed how differently he now perceived every sound and movement around him. The wilderness that had been his home for so many years had revealed a new layer of complexity. The tracks he had followed in, which had seemed so mysterious that morning, now told a clear story of cooperation and adaptation. He carefully marked his route on his GPS, knowing that researchers would soon want to study this area in detail. The implications of this discovery would reach far beyond the scientific community. It would challenge fundamental assumptions about animal intelligence and social structures. The footage and photographs Thomas carried would become the foundation for new research into wildlife behavior, leading to groundbreaking studies in animal cooperation and intelligence. The bear and wolves had demonstrated levels of social adaptation that would force humans to reconsider their understanding of wildlife consciousness and capability. When Thomas finally reached his truck, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows through the trees. He secured his equipment carefully, knowing that every image, every video clip would be scrutinized by experts around the world. The local community would soon understand what had been happening in their mountains. But Thomas knew this discovery belonged to more than just their small town. It would become part of humanity's growing understanding of the natural world's endless capacity to surprise and adapt. As he drove back down the Forest Service road, Thomas thought about how this discovery would change things. Researchers would come from around the world to study this unprecedented partnership. Conservation efforts would need to be adjusted to protect this unique relationship. The Forest Service would need to develop new guidelines for an ecosystem that now included this extraordinary predator alliance. But most importantly, this discovery would remind people that the natural world still held mysteries, still had the power to leave us speechless, with its ability to transcend our limited understanding of what was possible. Be part of our growing storytelling community on YouTube by subscribing to Tales That Transform. Click subscribe and hit the notification bell to get weekly stories that challenge what we think we know about life's extraordinary moments.